Hey everybody, 40 Sparky here. I thought I'd do a little tutorial today about aspect ratios. Try to explain really what it is and why you should care. Aspect ratios are basically the dimensions of the image expressed as a ratio. You measure the width, you measure the height, and you put them down in the form of a ratio. So you take the measurement of the width of the photograph, and it doesn't matter what unit of measure that you use, whether it's inches, centimeters, pixels, light years, chains, rods, miles, doesn't matter. As long as you use the same unit of measurement for the height of the photograph. And you simply express them as one dimension in relationship to another dimension. This image happens to be 4,000 pixels wide and 2,637 pixels tall. So the aspect ratio is 4,000 to 2,637. That's kind of a long way to get around it, so what I would do is I would divide both of them by the smaller number, and I come up with 1.52 and change to 1. I rounded it off to 1.52. The reason I chose that ratio is because this happens to be the ratio of my camera that I use, the Nikon D7000. Now, why does this have any bearing on photography? It's real simple. Let's say that you're a studio photographer. You shoot with a DSLR with a 1.52 to 1 ratio on the sensor. Prominent businessman in town comes in with his family, wants a portrait taken, so you frame them in your camera and you take this portrait. You may not think there's going to be much of an issue, but until, let's say, they want to get a 5x7. So I'm going to throw a 5x7 grid up here, and basically this, whatever 5 or 7 units here will measure 5 units here. And 5 units here will measure 7 units here. Doesn't matter how big or small I make it, it will still be 5 units by 7 units. Now, some labs will simply automatically center your image until the aspect ratio fills out one side or the other. What would happen in this case is this area and this area in the image would not be printed. That's if they default to the center. If they default to the right, you're okay. But if it's a lab that happens to default to the left, the lady of the family is not going to be too happy with part of her face being cut off. And remember too that you might lose a little bit more of this image if they're going to put it in a frame or have it matted. So if you can imagine her eye not even being in this photograph, she's not going to be too happy. Some labs will take the time to manually move the image around to the aspect ratio, and they may cut a little bit off here and a lot off here to get the image to fit. Again, that just depends on the lab and the printer that you're using. 5x7 you might be able to get by with. An 8x10, however, you're going to run into trouble, because an 8x10 isn't as, when you blow up an 8x10 to the same dimension this way, you've got less this way. So no matter what you do, you're going to be crowded to try to make this work. If your lab defaults to center, you've lofted up part of her head and you're coming awful close to this young lad here. If the lab defaults to the right, you've got the left side of his face and nothing else. If the lab happens to default to the left, you're not going to get paid for that print no matter what. Now there is a way around that, and one of them is to adjust the size manually. You unlock them and you change the width manually. I'm just going to go to 2700 pixels, and what that will do is it will narrow down the image. You saw it shrink down from this to this. That can save you in a case, because there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room for an 8x10 or a 4x6 or a 16x20. They're all the same aspect ratio. But the problem is you skinny everybody up, make them look like bean poles. So the real solution is to do what I call shoot wide. In other words, make sure you have plenty of space around your subject. So if you want a 5x7, you can adjust this however you want. You can crop it tight, or you can leave yourself some room, even more room. And basically you're going to crop this dark gray area out. Oh, I accidentally pushed the wrong button. All this gray area out here is going to be cropped out of the photograph. What you would do is, let's say you're happy with that. You can crop it, and you send this to your lab for the 5x7 because it will be 5 units by 7 units. Now if you want to order an 8x10 of that same one, you simply get an 8x10 mat out, and again you can adjust this before you even send it off to the lab and make sure that it's exactly where you want it. Crop that, and now you have an 8x10 formatted image. That's why it's important to understand aspect ratios and their relationships to each other. So with that, this is 480 Sparky. Go forth and actuate.